Symposium series going across Europe, talking about very important issues, really interesting comparative issues in procurement law involving procurement for innovation. We started our series in London a couple of days ago, and we were very privileged to be able to join our colleagues at the NATO Diana unit to talk about defense and security issues. Yesterday, we were in Paris, and we talked about global issues, including with input from the OECD on some of the global developments that we're seeing in procurement for innovation. Today, we're going to be focusing more closely on Europe, on developments here in Europe. We've got a really excellent set of presentations talking about, in a core way, about what the European Union might do as it revises its directives and moves forward in rethinking the regulation of procurement for innovation. And we're also going to be talking about some ancillary issues that are very important in this process, including issues such as artificial intelligence and also issues regarding state aid, how the state aid doctrine, which is such an important part of the law here in the European Union, might be shaped to accommodate procurement for innovation. So we're very, very glad that you could join us here today. Cheryl, can you put the next slide? As most of you know, I'm Chris Yukins. I'm the Lynn David Research Professor of Government Procurement Law at George Washington University, and together with Jessica Tillman, our Associate Dean, we run these webinar series, and this series is unique because we're doing it on a hybrid basis as well. We're in the Google offices today. We're very, very glad that we're very grateful that Google helped us by setting up these sessions in Paris and Milan. I joked about these other. I have to say today, we're not getting any money from Google, but we are getting delicious lunches, and we're very, very grateful for those delicious lunches and for the help from their team. The program today is going to be available on our YouTube page through the program, and Jessica Tillman will be working with our tech team to turn it into a podcast as well. The chat will be running during the session, but I have to say that the chat is difficult for us here's panelists to access. Other panelists are online. They'll be able to respond to your chat questions as well. And I want to stress that any statements from the speakers are in their personal capacity. Next slide, please. So today, as I said, we're focusing on European developments. What's really interesting about this is that it's how it links back to the earlier sessions. For example, many of the reforms that we're going to be talking about today that are recommended for the European Union are in fact reforms that are already being advanced in the United Kingdom. We've heard about that from Professor Luke Butler from Nottingham, and that are also been really put into practice by the NATO Diana unit in London, and that also appear in the National Defense Authorization Act. The National Defense Authorization Act is still in political debate in Washington, but the National Defense Authorization Act in the U.S. Congress includes many of the reforms. We talked about this on Wednesday, includes many of the reforms that we'll be talking today about for the European Union. The slides from Wednesday and through Thursday are available on the program page, which is at publicprocurementinternational.com. Next slide, please. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my co-moderator, Gabriella Racca. Gabriella is a very cherished colleague. She is a full professor of administrative law at University of Turin, just very close by here to Milan. And she and I worked on many projects. She's going to be discussing those with you. She is a leader in understanding how procurement law should be developed and improved here in the European Union. And she's helped me with several books on point. She'll be talking about some of our ongoing projects. Gabriella?
Okay, thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here with you and to discuss on this topic that we are studying and researching year by year. So how can we close the gap, the innovation gap? We already, in the previous day, we had this problem on the table. So we had the idea that the European Commission and the European Parliament want to push innovation. So the idea to try a way to overcome this gap. And we did a lot of research on this. And the main outcome that we are sharing today with you and with whoever would like to join our research project on the idea that we have to simplify the qualification procedure for innovative supplier. And so the idea of having not only a 28th special procurement, special regime for companies, for innovative companies, but also special procurement regime, special rules dedicated to procurement with a once-only qualification. So the idea to develop the ID supplier wallet in order not to have to enter all different platforms for the qualification many times. So the once-only qualification, I think it's one of the core goal that we have to push and to develop in the next reform of the directive. And also UK in their reform are going in this way. The second idea is the dedicated platform for cross-border procurement of innovation. I'm deeply convinced that innovation can be pushed only if we join efforts. And so we need a specific platform that is compliant to the EU provision that should be either now the financial regulation or a further instruments of regulation that will be approved. So a 28 special discipline regime maybe is not the good work for American colleagues, so we can change it. But the idea of having a joint procurement platform that could help to make a supplier enter, to specify and define in specific sector the group of supplier or potential supplier or potential SMEs or companies that want to develop innovation to work together. So to push them to work together in order to develop quicker the new solution. So we have to sharing the needs also in national interoperable platform, interoperable with the European platform that we can imagine to develop in the next reform. And so sharing the needs, sharing the evolution of possible solution, and then reach the prototype and then the possible outcome of the innovation to be shared all around the world. So these are the main points that I wanted to share with you. And just the references, we are here and online with Jessica and with Chris, with the American friends. I always recall the desiderata of Stephen Schoenmaekers and the idea of how this desiderata evolved toward the idea of strategic innovation, sustainability, green, circular, social. So we have plenty of idea on what we want from this procurement money and efforts, and now the digital transformation and AI as a strategic tool. And I really appreciated yesterday from Jessica the idea of either buying AI and then AI for buying, you know, and the idea of having both. And I'm much more concentrating on the second step, and that's why I really want to share with you the idea of how to evolve the platform for buying better, so making it more efficient and changing the way we want to buy. So this is the landscape that we want to focus on. The EU Parliament obviously put the emphasis on the idea that the actual rules that don't work. We didn't have any very little success of this procedure, so we have to evolve them. And in this last perspective that I wanted to share, we can pass through all the European rules on innovation, and then we can have a clear idea in comparison also with what was discussed yesterday. For example, also the Edouard Laboulay yesterday told, in London, asked how can we evolve the clauses in order to make innovation entering the way in the contract execution. So to admit clauses that permits to award the contract today, but having in mind that the contract will permit to take to implement innovation in the meanwhile they're coming out. Not to have a contract that has been awarded last year and now is already obsolete. So we have to take care of all this. So research and development, pre-commercial procurement, PPI, procurement of innovation, as a sequence of what comes out in an innovation partnership, but this kind of procedure didn't work, in my opinion. So we have also all the normal procedures, competitive procedure with negotiation, competitive dialogue, but these procedures are not adapted. So I think the effort is to concentrate our reform, European reform, on specifying the sector of innovation that we want to deal in. So that's why I push on a specific platform, because otherwise we mix the capacity or the lack of capacity of procurement official that have to do the award procedure according to a legal framework with the idea and the problem of knowledge of the domain of the innovation in which we want they consider and select the company that could face this challenge better. So I think we have really to consider all these complex set of rules and to simplify and to evolve them through digital transformation. So just for a quick reference to the story, the research with Professor Yukins, Joint Public Procurement and Innovation of 2019. So I think the book is still there. You can read it and comment on this, and then in the next book of innovation, but through digital transformation and AI. We are collecting all possible contributions. So if any of you is interested, I'm ready to work with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gabriella. This will many of the issues that Gabriella identified for the European Union are issues that we talked about already in the context of the American experience. And we're going to be, in March, we'll be having a program to talk about these issues further, to see how the developments are unfolding in the United States and how they reflect what might be best practices for Europe as well. I just want to take a minute and thank our coordinators from Google, the team here in Milan, and of course, Racca is joining us today from Washington. So to put this into context, since the 1960s, there's been a community of George Washington University Law School, in a broader procurement law community that's existed for many, many years. That community is now becoming international. That's one of the lessons from this series, is that we can expand these networks internationally. And Racca is a graduate of our program. He's the legal director at Google Public Sector. He's also an adjunct professor at GW. Part of this community is that our graduates come back and they help teach the next generation of students in a very wonderful way. At Google, Racca leads the Google Public Sector legal teams covering cloud sales to government customers, engaging in transactional, technical product and compliance matters. Since he earned his LLM at GW Law in 2007, he's represented contractors in all aspects of government contract formation, administration, and litigation issues. He holds a JD from Roger Williams University School of Law and a bachelor's from James Madison University. Racca, are you there?
I am. Apologies for my camera issues. It keeps cutting in and out.
Thank you very much for helping us put this together, Racca.
Of course. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for putting these programs on. These are incredibly helpful for a lot more reasons than you may even think. And I can speak for a lot of people when I say thank you very much for continuing to put these on. Thanks,
Racca. So Jessica Tillman, our Associate Dean at GW, will be joining us in just a second to talk about some AI issues. She is and we joke about this every day, she's the Associate Dean for Government Procurement Law Studies at the Government Contract Advisory Council, Distinguished Professorial Lecturer in Government Contracts Law. She leads the program. She does a wonderful job at that. She is a leading authority in public procurement, corruption, and the governance of artificial intelligence in the public sector, with a particular focus on integrity, compliance, and emerging technology risks in government contracting. So pay very close attention to what Jessica's about to tell you, because in many ways, what she's saying about the dangers of AI, the policy prescriptions are opposite to the policy prescriptions we're seeing elsewhere in this domain. And that highlights a very important tension here. One of the reasons we have to have these discussions within the legal community is how to figure out, okay, how do we advance procurement for innovation, but at the same time deal with some of the special risks that are emerging in the context of artificial intelligence. We're going to be joined by a team afterwards from the Corvers Consultancy, which is based in Holland. And because of problems because of plane cancellations, Stephan Corvers can't join us, but he leads that group in Holland, and his group did a really outstanding report. We're going to get a summary of that, and what it means for the European Union, what it means for the European Commission moving forward. So in my career, I've reviewed literally hundreds of these reports over time. I have to say this is one of the best reports because it really is incredibly broad. It brings in insights and best practices from around the world and comes up with some very concrete suggestions that really, very interestingly, parallel what's going on in the United States. So you're seeing parallel developments in the United States and in Europe, and one of the purposes of programs like this is to try to bridge that gap back and forth. One of the leaders in the studies was Lucia Jaramillo, and she won't be able to join us because of this issue with the claims. But she's been a really wonderful partner to work with. She's a senior legal procurement researcher at Corvers. She specializes in European public procurement law and alternative dispute resolution. Anna really led the team of experts from around the world putting this report together, and we're very, very grateful to her for that. We're also going to be hearing from two students you heard from yesterday, Lena Racca and Hayan. Yesterday, Hayan took the lead. She's an SJD candidate with us at GW, and Lena's going to take the lead today. Yesterday, Hayan talked about what competitive dialogue, competitive negotiations, competitive procedures negotiations are. Lena today is going to take a slightly different approach, and the two of them are parallel in the research. Lena's working on her LLM thesis, and what Lena will be talking about from a slightly more critical standpoint, she'll be talking about why the systems, while they're parallel between the European Union and the United States, why for cultural and economic reasons, why it is that she's finding in her research that the United States does take a different approach to multilateral negotiations, which are a very, very important part of making procurement for innovation work. Cheryl Blake is here with us. Cheryl is, as I mentioned in the earlier session, she's an LLM candidate in our program. She's an officer in the U.S. Air Force. She's really done a wonderful job helping us put together this series, and I'm very, very grateful to her for having done that. You can hit the next slide.
Yep.
So because Stephan and Anna can't join us, Azra Atalan is going to be stepping in for them for Corvers. She'll be talking about the European Union study that was done under the auspices of the European Commission. We're very, very grateful she can step in. Next slide. And Sarah Schoenmaekers is going to be joining us to talk about, it's funny, because I'm a nerd, I read these reports. In annex, the first annex to Azra, to your report, is a small reference to the issues of state aid, and Sarah's going to be expanding on that issue. So for the Americans who really don't know what state aid is, state aid is a doctrine that's very important here in the European Union. It puts limitations on how member states can give aid, for example, to industry. It's a way for Brussels to ensure that the individual member states don't distort marketplaces by in a random way or in an irresponsible way affording state aid. So it's a very, very important doctrine here in the European Union, and logically it could impede the procurement for innovation. It can impede innovation, the development of innovation, if it's seen as a form of state aid. So Sarah will be talking about the legal interplay between the two doctrines. Next slide, please. Okay, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jessica Tillman. Jessica, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Chris. And I already put a note in the chat. I've told them to behave, but we are full of snow here in the Washington area. So if a small human walks behind me, I apologize because my kids are on a school delay. So thanks. And for those of you that are just joining us for the first time today, we talked about a similar issue, but and a related issue. So I will touch on that briefly. But, you know, I got interested in kind of the intersection of AI and procurement about 5 years ago, which now in terms of AI feels like a lifetime ago, given how rapidly this incredible technology has developed. And I did so because I was fascinated by the ways that AI could actually improve integrity and reduce risk in procurement. And indeed, globally, we have seen AI used in a variety of ways, whether it's, you know, identifying outdated or incorrect clauses in a contract, helping to synthesize past performance and pre-qualification tasks, helping to, pre-qualify contractors, and increasingly also a variety of governments around the world are started to use it to identify anomalies and identify things that might be potentially fraudulent or collusive. So again, the number of anti-corruption tasks associated with AI, how it could make it improve, how it could be more efficient, more effective, and frankly, evaluate huge amounts of data and information far more effectively and efficiently than human beings is really, the unlimited. So that's a very exciting development, and there are incredible resources out there. I think OECD maps it in their recent report. You can read the organization MITRE in the United States has a report on this as well. So there are many groups, Transparency International, among others, who have mapped this as well. So that's putting that aside. But as I began my research 3 years ago on a paper focused on the anti-corruption benefits of AI, I increasingly became concerned about the corruption risks associated with AI. Now, let me be clear. I love AI. I love the tools. And again, as I said yesterday, a shout out to Google's Notebook LM, which is by far one of my favorite tools, and I use all the time to assist me with learning new things. You can make podcasts out of information. It's an incredible resource, so I encourage people to check it out, especially GW students who are listening, because you get a subscription as a student. So there's great resources, but increasingly, again, I started to recognize that systems, particularly the United States system, which has one of the most sophisticated and mature anti-corruption systems in the world when it comes to procurement, is now increasingly at risk because the way it is proceeding, the AI policies, the AI procurement policies, are increasingly inverting all those long-standing best practices that we've known and turning them. And some of that is inherent in AI itself, and some of that is contractually developing. It's because of the contractual choices that the United States and other governments, state, local, federal, school systems, universities are deciding to make and how they buy and then eventually deploy AI. And the two are interrelated. How you buy AI inevitably impacts how it may be deployed in the procurement process. Next slide, please. All right, so part of it, again, is that AI itself has inherent weaknesses. And again, some of that is due to the technology, some of that is due to market concentration, and some of that, of course, is again due to how the governments are buying it. So traditional safeguards like transparency will become significantly more difficult with AI because we know that, and it's been said many times, AI is like a black box. Now, some of that, again, is going to be technically a part of AI, but some of that is contractual. How we buy, if we don't negotiate certain rights, certain transparency rights, certain audit rights, certain oversight rights and reporting requirements in our contracts with AI providers, then we will lack that inherent transparency that have been present in long-standing contracts with other types of technologies and for other goods and services. Competition requirements, again, are going to be significantly more difficult in a concentrated market. And we know when we look at the supply chain, the AI supply chain, we have an extreme concentration in the cloud service providers, infrastructure. We have extreme concentration in chip providers, in semiconductors. We have extreme concentration in the foundation model providers, again, given the capital requirements associated with that. And inevitably, that's going to reduce the amount of competition that we're going to see. And in my new article, which is going to be out in the next week or so, I've been working on it now for well over a year. It's in the final stages of editing with the PCLJ, but I'll have an open source copy in the next week or so available, and which Chris will link to on his site. And of course, it'll be available more broadly on SSRN. I walk you through that concentration. And at some point I was thinking about how could we have a competition multiplier in the AI space, maybe in the application aspect. And again, that's also another challenge for our entire field, which is that most people understand AI in terms of the button we push or the prompt we enter to help us fix something around the house or do research on something. Whereas AI is a very complex ecosystem below the surface, and without being able to peek below, and I say peek beneath the hood to see the brain, which is the foundation model in many instances, or many of the other things operating below the surface, it's very difficult to detect these things. And because of the fact that it's also a technology, we know there's always extreme risk of what we call lock-in when you're buying technologies if you don't negotiate a government's exit at the time of award, if you don't negotiate interoperability, if you don't negotiate reduced or no or zero egress fees, among other requirements to ensure you can maintain competition, even in a constrained market. Conflict of interest rules, I'm going to put a pin in and I'm going to come back to, but in my article for the first time, I effectively tear apart the ecosystem to show you where you may have lurking conflicts of interest, both in the application of AI, but also even below the surface in the customization of foundation models. And then finally, we know that as AI capabilities increase, the ability to manipulate it by bad actors through fraud, through manipulation, through data poisoning, through prompt injection, through a variety of known AI risks only grows. And as you start to use AI in the procurement process, that grows too. People that are able to use deepfake technology to imitate key personnel, to provide oral presentations, to make up fake factories or fake documents for fake billing. It's all going to become far more sophisticated and challenging. And so when I raise these issues, it's because how we're buying it also impacts that. You can go ahead to the next slide, please. I like to analogize, and I used this analogy yesterday, how we buy it can actually either exacerbate these natural tensions or it can reduce them. So I'll give you by way of example, when the government buys a service to construct a bridge, construction services. If you knew that within 6 months of constructing that bridge, it suddenly changed its load-bearing weight, you would preemptively try to negotiate for that. You would employ different tools, whether it's oversight and testing requirements, to reduce that risk. AI drifts, yet increasingly, if you default to certain commercial terms and conditions and you're buying of AI, you may not accurately capture that. If you had a government tool that did mapping that suddenly invented buildings or roads or streams, you would have integrated testing and audit and oversight requirements. AI routinely hallucinates, yet not necessarily are governments negotiating this, right? To have all these additional testing requirements, if again, they're defaulting to traditional commercial terms and conditions when they license the AI applications either directly or through license upgrades with enterprise agreements. And then third, if you had a bulletproof vest that protected some people given their demographic group, but not others, you would clearly have concerns about that product and would bake things into the contract to try to prevent that, test that, result in reporting requirements and testing. AI demonstrates extreme bias, yet we see, again, if you're defaulting and you don't bake those protections into a contract, you're not protecting the government customer and ultimately the end users and even public citizens that will be using these services. So we know that there are corruption risks unique to it. One of the ones that I spend the most time in my article talking about is this potential for what we call either unintentional or even self-dealing. If the application provider, the vendor that provides the application, for example, let's say they have an application, an AI application that can evaluate proposals. If that evaluation references documents from that own vendor's past successful proposals, or even the application is trained or fine-tuned in a way that reflects that vendor's own past proposals, it may then evaluate proposals in a biased way towards that vendor. In the United States, we have a sophisticated framework which deals with things like organizational conflicts of interest, which would consider that potentially a form of self-dealing in which you'd want to mitigate that risk at the outset. If, for example, a foundation model has been customized for end users because of a government purpose, if that customizer, again, trains or fine-tunes that foundation model or uses a set of reference materials based on its own proposals, again, we may have the same conflict of interest. But if there's no insight into the AI supply chain, we don't know if those potential conflicts exist. And so asking these questions, negotiating these rights at the outset is going to be critical. Again, I talked about fraud and how that's going to become increasingly problematic. There's another growing risk. We have significant workforce capacity strain globally, where you have acquisition workforces around the world who are not yet prepared or AI literate enough to be buying these things in a sophisticated and educated manner. And the challenge that becomes is you may have to increasingly rely on vendors to teach you these things. And when there's an over-reliance on vendors, we know from history that can result in significant corruption, integrity, and oversight issues. So again, ensuring we have appropriate literacy within our workforce. And of course, that's going to result in then over reliance sometimes on AI outputs, which we often refer to as automation bias, and it becomes a vicious cycle. You may not have the literacy to adequately oversee what you're using. You soon become reliant on that, and then increasingly people lose the skill set necessary to question the AI outputs. Again, that's automation bias. There's going to be potentially proprietary opacity, which again, when I hear of Gabriella, my friend Gabriella, talking about AI for acquisition, if you're going to be using it in a way that drafts solicitation requirements or evaluates proposals, if you don't have insight because of contractual limitations that don't allow you to understand the rationale or the decisions appropriately, you can't necessarily have a fair system. And then finally, again, we are going to be at increasing risk of system gaming and model manipulation. This is across the board a risk that many AI vendors are also worried about. And if you can imagine a weakness overall, you can imagine how bad actors could come in and manipulate procurement systems in a bad way. And unfortunately, development favors the bad actors, the generators of the improper behavior. And it really is an arms race between the detection tools, which are not quite up to par with the people that are exploiting AI. And that's going to be a challenge for governments to come. Next slide, please. So what are your global lessons? And again, keeping in mind this is a very short, a short aspect of my 70-page article, which maps very cleanly a lot of these growing risks that we need to take into account. First is that AI needs governance. One of the things I've been most unhappy about is what we refer to in the United States as one-gov deals, where effectively the government is negotiating with vendors to provide below market AI tools to induce rapid expansion of AI or rapid adoption across the federal government. In the United States, we refer to this as buy-in. It's a replication of the commercial loss leader strategy. You come in cheap with the understanding that you're getting your foot in the door. People get used to these tools. And then when it's time for renewal, that's when the price explodes. And if you haven't sufficiently negotiated, exit rights, you run the risk of lock-in. This is not just the United States. This is a global model. Even my children's school district just recently told us that they've been locked in to a prominent AI provider, not Google, I will say that, a prominent AI provider for 2 years for a, quote, pilot program. And my argument to the school district is, if you think that the school district is going to unwind, those workflows are going to unwind in 2 years when the pilot is over, you are sorely mistaken. And now that company effectively owns you, because that price is going to go up and you're going to be locked into that solution. And that's a global challenge people need to wrestle with. I'm a huge fan of free or below market AI for small pilots, tiny sandboxes, but using pilots with below market AI for rapid expansion to me is not a good practice. Don't assume that markets can self-regulate. I understand that there are concerns as AI vendors grapple with changing regulations and regulatory systems across the globe. But nevertheless, the United States has a long-standing history where we outsource too much and don't provide sufficient oversight. That leads to significant failures, even catastrophic failures. I only need to cite something like Boeing to demonstrate that, and people understand what that means. Don't treat workforce expertise as optional, and also make sure procurement has a seat at the table. This is not just about technology or policymakers. If procurement is not consulted at the outset, you are effectively just reducing them to order fulfillment. Procurement needs to be there, part of the conversation at the outset, to make these intelligent decisions about the risks associated with certain tools. And I already talked about free or well below market AI for scale. Lock-in will happen faster than expected. We are all bracing for impact after these dollar deals expire in the United States. Having a contract is not a great form of regulation. We know, my great friend and colleague, Professor Albert Sanchez-Graels, describes regulation by contract as a regulatory hallucination. It is. It's an ineffective and profoundly inadequate way to regulate AI. So let's stop deferring to that method. Governments need to build their capacity, and right now we see a lot of cart before horse movement happening globally. We also know that governance will shape markets commercially. We've seen that over and over as governments adopt and use their spending power for to influence the commercial marketplace. Practical recommendations, I map this out in much more detail in my article. Building red teaming capacity in-house, whether as a service, whether having a centralized tool or by agency. I think centralization makes more sense. Mandate transparency clauses. I hear you, AI vendors. I hear you, my friend and colleague Arash is here. He's actually one of our course professors here on how to buy tech. I get it. It's proprietary. I understand that. But we have systems in place for that. The United States model, we have that with our cybersecurity. You can use a third party, stick an independent third party, put it under an NDA. You can grant transparency, even when stuff is proprietary. So it's not impossible. Invest in workforce training and education. I encourage actually thinking about specialized oversight tools or mechanisms to help ensure we understand AI integrity. And finally, again, negotiate your exit before award or the vendor owns you when that promotional period or initial period expires. All right, I can hear my children getting rowdy, and I will stop talking.
They're definitely getting rested. Thanks a lot. Just to put Jessica's work into context of the leadership she's shown in this area. So thanks to her scholarship and her leadership, many of our students are doing work in this area. So one of our students, for example, works for a major weapons systems company and works on supply chain analysis, compliance analysis to see whether or not the suppliers through the supply chain are complying with anti-corruption requirements. And through the work that Jessica's done, the student's been able to flip the question upside down. Instead of saying, hey, AI is going to make it possible to immediately tell whether or not there's corruption in the supply chain, she's turned it upside down. She said, well, wait a minute. If we use AI at all, because of the distortions and the hallucinations, in fact, the conclusions we reach may be unreliable. So, and that's a very important development. Jessica?
Yeah, I just want to quickly follow up. There's a question here. It's a great question. And it's actually one I receive a lot when I'm talking about this, which is, could we use a closed environment? I actually sometimes think that might be more risky. Some of the tools, for example, I can't envision, for example, a conflict of interest with a foundation model that, for example, Google's Gemini or, OpenAI's, the GPT family, for example, or Anthropic's when you've got these massive foundation models, I don't see that happening because it's just the data universe is just way too broad, which is why I focused at potential conflicts that arise at the customization level and at the application level. And again, I'm saying this in the abstract. If you're not AI familiar with the supply chain, which many people are not, when I walk in and I ask about the tech stack and who's familiar, there is a wedding cake that I use in my article to help people kind of visualize it. It's not technically accurate, but it at least helps you understand what's beneath the hood. The question about it being a closed circuit, the challenge you have with that is, what are you training it on, right? What are you training it on? What is your reference library? We talk about RAG, all these kind of terminology I try to keep out of my presentation so that it can be more easily understood by folks that aren't as tech experienced. And I also, by the way, I'm not a technologist. I'm a lawyer, law professor. So, if you think about AI referencing a library, if you are training it on that same proposal, and that actually leads to bias. If you, let's say you're a government office and your training or the reference library that your tool is using, references like past successful proposals, that can actually have a negative impact on new entrants because it's trained on incumbents' proposals, which will then teach the tool that that's a marker of quality, the same nomenclature, the same methods. And so it may be harder for new entrants if you're using it, for example, to rate or score proposals, which would then maybe not perceive something from a newer entrant that is actually a better way to do it. Might not see it as high quality, even if it's producing something that's better. So that's a quick, tiny way of describing it.
Thank you very much, Jessica. Azra, can I beg your indulgence? Sarah has to go for outside obligations in a couple minutes. Would it be okay, Azra, if she goes first?
Yeah, of course. Please go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And Sarah, as I said, thank you very much for being here. Sarah's from Maastricht University. She also teaches at Hasselt University in construction law. Sarah is a real leader among European professors. She's a joy to work with. I'm very, very glad that she could join us here today. And as I mentioned before, she's going to talk about state aid issues, how the constraints of state aid might be reconciled with procurement for innovation. Sarah?
Thank you very much, Chris. Also, Gabriella, very happy to be here online. Yes, as you can see on the next slide, if you look at the Public Procurement Directive, then state aid is only mentioned once. And actually, it's only mentioned with regard to abnormally low tenders, because the directive says that if a tender is abnormally low because of state aid, then rejection is only possible if the economic operator cannot prove that the state aid is compatible. Now, what does that mean? Whether state aid is compatible, it means that there is state aid, but the state aid has been granted for a good reason. There is a noble goal, a good cause. And these noble goals you can either find in the treaty, in Article 107 of the Treaty of the European Union. And there you can find, for example, that aid which makes good damage caused by natural disasters is allowed, or aid to remedy a serious disturbance in a member state is allowed, or to save certain economic sectors. And that is what happened a lot in the past when we had the financial crisis, when we had COVID. So every time that there were subsidies granted in those days, then it was considered state aid, but compatible aid because of this noble goal. You don't only find such noble goals in the treaty, but also in a general block exemption regulation that is created by the European Commission. And that is a very handy document, because in that regulation, you can find specific aid that is really related to research and development and innovation, RD&I. So what you find, for example, is that what we also consider to be good aid, compatible aid, is aid for innovation clusters, innovation aid for SMEs, and aid for process and organizational innovation. Now, this regulation has been updated a bit in 2023, and you will see that there are some more types included when it comes to aid for research and development and innovation. But these are still very important ones, the ones that I mentioned here. Now, maybe first, what is state aid? I just refer to a subsidy, but it is much broader than that, because if a company, for example, gets a tax cut or has to pay no or less taxes or gets a grant or any kind of advantage, for example, the interest rates that you have to pay back to the state are much lower than the ones you would have to pay to a private bank, to a normal market economic operator on the private market. We call this aid, that is artificial, an artificial advantage, and it is always granted by the state, but the state is interpreted broadly, so it can also be a municipality, a province, but also public undertakings. So if a public undertaking grants an advantage, and this is attributable to the state because the state actually condones that, then that is also falling under the notion. Now, in European law, we only care about state aid if there is if there's a distortion of competition. And that means quite a lot, because if the state aid is below 300,000 euros per undertaking over 3 years, we don't even consider it to be state aid in the first place, because it is so low that we believe this is not going to distort competition at all. But if you look in the Commission regulation, then you see there are high thresholds for state aid for research and development and innovation. What does that mean? That if you give aid up to, for example, 7.5 million, we do call that state aid. We do say there's a restriction of competition, but we consider that to be good aid for the noble goal, and we actually like that. So what does it actually mean, aid for innovation clusters? Well, then we are actually talking about groups of private companies, independent parties, for example, that work together with research organizations, for example. And if you give aid so that they can develop something new, if they can develop an innovative product, we don't mind that. But if the aid is granted, then you also have to take into account the aid eligibility, because you can always say, I give state aid, and then these companies, these SMEs, they can use that, for example, to go out to dinner, to have some discussions with each other. But that is not what the aid is for. The aid really has to be eligible, which means that it can only be happening to cover the personnel and the administrative cost, or cost for obtaining patents, or to obtain and search for highly qualified personnel, or to have buildings in which innovative products or services are created. That is what we call aid eligibility. So the amount of money that you get when it comes to state aid for innovation can only be used for these specific subcategories. And then if you look on the next slide, then on top of that, you also see that there is an aid intensity. What does it mean? If you then get money for to innovate as an SME, then you see that there's a percentage of 50%. That means that if you get money, that means that 50% to do this project, this innovative project, has to be covered by you as an SME. Because what we don't want is that companies get lazy, that they just knock on the door of the state asking for money for innovation, because what we always need is that the states, that the companies invest themselves as well. And that is what we call aid intensity. And you see here it is 50%, but in this regulation, you also see that for different types of state aid, we have also different percentages. But here you see companies have to bring 50% of the money themselves. And if you then look at the next slide, I repeat it again what is in the Public Procurement Directive, because this is specifically about this compatible state aid. So every time you have a noble goal, like here, state aid for innovation, state aid for SMEs that innovate, then you can actually not really reject a tender on the basis of that, because rejection is only allowed if you cannot prove that state aid is compatible. But when state aid is given for an innovative reason, it is always considered to be compatible. Of course, as long as you don't go over the thresholds that this general block exemption regulation allows for. And then in the next slide, you can see one more specific element, and that is the communication from the Commission for State Aid for Research and Development Innovation. Why is this interesting today? Because here you have a reference to public procurement. So this whole communication is actually repeating what I just stated, that if you have innovative state aid, then it is state aid, but it is considered to be good state aid. It is allowed for. But now in this communication, you see that if you invest money in an SME, for example, that is involved in an innovative business, and you select that SME on the basis of an open tender, then the Commission considers that not to be state aid in the first place. So there's a difference between calling something no state aid, and that is only allowed for if there has been an open tender, and calling something state aid, but state aid that is compatible, that is good aid, that is noble aid. So what you see here is that if you have a noble goal like innovation, research and development, normally the conclusion would be this is state aid, but compatible aid. But the Commission says this is not state aid in the first place, which means that you are also not caught by the thresholds. So you can even grant more because it is no state aid at all. It is always going to be considered to be fine, even if you would be above the thresholds, even if you would have aid for where the aid intensity percentage would be higher. Now, what is interesting is that if you look at the communication, the Commission says it is only no state aid if you use an open procedure or a restrictive procedure, but for all other procedures, like the competitive dialogue, the competitive procedure with negotiation, we only say that there's no state aid if these 4 conditions that are mentioned here on the slide are fulfilled. And that is saying actually that there's a higher standard when it comes to competitive dialogue, competitive procedure with negotiations, which is in a certain way funny, because those are the procedures that you normally would use if you want to do something more innovative, something more complex in public procurement. So I thought that that was very interesting to see. As a conclusion I would actually say that if the new directive would be potentially revised when it comes to state aid, then I think that what is in there now is fine, that a rejection of a tender is only possible if a company cannot prove that a state aid is compatible. So I still think that that is fine. But maybe something could also be added about what if the advantage that is given, the aid that is given, is actually not to be considered aid in the first place because of what is mentioned here. So there may be aid that is not falling under the scope of Article 107, that is not going to be caught, that is not going to be even have to be declared compatible because it is no state aid to begin with. Maybe that could also be mentioned somewhere. It should perhaps not only be a question about whether the aid is compatible, but whether the advantage that given is considered to be state aid in the first place. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah. So thank you for really that brilliant summary of this issue. I have to say, Sarah, for most folks who are outside the European Union, the lawyers are just not aware of what state aid doctrine is. So thank you for making it so accessible and so understandable. A really important part of the procurement for innovation. Thanks again. So if you could flip Cheryl back to the beginning of Azra's slides, that'd be great. So Azra is going to be sitting in for the rest of the Corvers team. Azra, thank you very much for doing that. I had a chance to meet with Azra when I visited the Corvers headquarters. She is going to be talking about a very complex report. And I think it's really worth digesting what the report has to offer, because it really points the way forward for how the European Commission, how the European Union can address this issue of procurement for innovation in the coming years as the process unfolds with the new directives. Azra was trained in Istanbul. She was trained in Krakow as well. And she brings just a wealth of talent as a lawyer and as an analyst, as you can see from this report, to this really complex area. So thank you from the community, Azra, for a report that's genuinely admirable.
Yeah, thank you very much for the nice words and for introduction. I'm very happy to be here. Very interesting discussions, and I'm learning a lot. And you have already introduced myself and also our law firm. Just to briefly recap, my name is Azra Atalan. I'm a legal consultant working at Corvers Procurement Services, which is a legal consultancy firm specialized in innovation procurement. And we support public authorities and organizations in designing, implementing, and improving procurement processes. And we also provide guidance through innovation procurement modalities. So here today, you see we led this project, Innovation Procurement Uptake Project, of course, under a European Commission's initiative. And we have we have done an extensive study, and now I would like to share the results, the key findings with you, but I will try to keep it very brief considering the time. However, please feel free to go dive into the slide and the report if you have time, if you'd like to later, because I know that the slides will be shared with you. So we can move to the next one. Here you see the agenda. First, I will introduce you the project in the background and the methodology we have followed during this study, and then I will present the overview of results, the key findings, and then I will move to the conclusions and the recommendations part, and then we will have some time for open discussions if possible. So you can move to the next slide, please. Yes, thank you. So here, yeah, the goal of this project is to drive more innovation through public purchasing. And we wanted to understand how laws and regulations can better support innovation in procurement. So in other words, how can we change the legal framework so that public buyers more easily purchase innovative solutions. To find out, we examined both European and national rules, and we compared them with practices in other leading countries. And we focused on identifying the legal hurdles that companies face when offering innovative solutions to governments and finding ways to overcome those barriers. And ultimately, our motivation is to recommend changes that will boost innovation uptake in public procurement across Europe. And in the next slides, you will see the background. Several high-level reports have raised concern about legal barriers to innovation procurement. In particular, here you see you can click on the links and visit the reports in detail later. The Draghi report, Letta report, and European Court of Auditors ECHA reports, they all highlighted the same issue, and they call for removing legal obstacles that prevent Europe from unlocking the full potential of innovation through public procurement. And these reports identified several recurring problems. Here you see the list. We can mention a few already: a lack of competition and transparency in procurement processes, the absence of national action plans with clear goals, timelines, and resources, and financial thresholds that are too high, and these causing excluding startups and SMEs. And we identified some additional SME barriers, slow procedures, and limited access to financing, and tender documents that are too prescriptive, which prevents innovative offers. And we have identified unclear and unfavorable IPR rules, discouraging commercialization. And there are difficulties for small firms to access sectors dominated by large players. And you see stated contracts that do not reward performance improvements over time, and imbalance in international competition, where EU suppliers lose to low-cost bids, and missed opportunities to promote EU strategic autonomy, and finally, the lack of user-friendly legal framework for joint cross-border procurement. So the message from all these reports is as follows. Without reform, Europe will continue to underuse public procurement as a tool for innovation. And here you see boosting innovation procurement from 10% to 20% could generate up to 300 billion euros in additional investment. So this could help address major societal needs, support industrial development, and reinforce EU resilience. So to unlock this potential, action was needed, and through a revision of procurement directives and new EU innovation and startup policy initiatives, and that is how this study was triggered. If we move to the next slide, I would like to introduce you the methodology. Here you see, okay, it was a very, very extensive study, but how did we approach this study? We brought together a group of public procurement experts from across Europe and beyond. And in total, experts from 33 countries worked with us. This includes all EU member states, plus countries like the United Kingdom, United States, Canada, Japan, China, and South Korea. And each expert examined their country's laws and practices related to innovation procurement. And they assessed the state of play, identifying what has worked and what barriers exist in their national context. And we also looked at international best practices in those non-European countries to see how they tackle similar challenges. So by comparing these insights, we were able to spot common obstacles and effective strategies that will be presented to you in a minute. So if you move to the next slide, you will see here experts involved. As mentioned, this project had a broad global reach. We had experts from 33 countries, and every EU member state was represented in our group, ensuring full coverage of Europe. In addition, we included experts from key international peers, the non-EU countries, namely UK, USA, Canada, Japan, China, and South Korea. And with this diverse, the team gave us a rich view of how innovation procurement is handled around the world, and we have also learned a lot from their practices. And the next,
If I could just so we just a shout out to my former research assistant, Aaron Silva, who's now in private practice. He helped on this project. We did a pro bono, and we were really honored to be able to contribute to this from the U.S. perspective.
Yes, thank you very much. We have also learned a lot from U.S. practices that inspired a lot the the key recommendations and conclusions. And it is absolutely extremely appreciated that it was a pro bono based study of yours, and thank you very much for that. Yes, I see on the chat there, people are reacting. Thank you very much. So, okay, if it is okay, I can move with the next slide. Yeah. Okay, so okay, expert task. So what exactly did these experts do? They did a very hardworking job, very challenging and time investing job. So we really appreciate it a lot. And well, namely, each expert had clear tasks in the project. We provided a template. They based on that template, they reviewed their national procurement framework to see how it supports or hinders innovation, and they identified legal barriers in their country that make it hard for companies to offer innovative solutions to the government. And they also highlighted good practices, tools, or approach that's already being used to encourage innovation in their countries. And based on their findings, experts suggested ways to overcome the barriers they found. For example, recommending specific legal changes or new guidelines. So I think it was also a very good opportunity for experts to learn from each other as well. And yeah, all this information was then shared and discussed within the group. And finally, the experts contributed to the final report and bringing together all the country analysis, comparisons, and recommendations into one comprehensive set of results. That is our final report. If you move to next slide. Here, I would like to show you this is a table of contents of the reports before we dive deeper. So you can see how it is designed. Here, the report begins with an executive summary, followed by the introduction and scope of the assignment. That it then explains the methodology used. The core of the report is in section 4, which identifies the main barriers and gaps. And then we have section 5, gives an overview of gaps in both the legal framework and practice. And then section 6 provides conclusions and legal recommendations at both EU and national level. And we have the annexes. They include regulatory framework, lessons from case studies that was provided by the experts in EU case law, and expert team list, and all of the country assessments are already included as an
So if I just could, Azra, throw in. So for my students and for others who are trying to get a deep dive, but quickly understand the regulatory structure, Annex 1 is an excellent resource to understand the legal structure that applies in the European Union. And Annex 3, keeping up and tracking the EU case law is really hard for foreigners, Azra, partly because of the complexity of the case law. Annex 3 is a very, very useful summary, and thank you for that.
Yeah. Our team invested a lot of time to collect all the relevant cases into the annex, and yeah, the cases are picked for to be to the point, to point out the specific barriers and challenges and how it has been tackled. So really hope that everyone will find it useful. Okay, so we can move to the next slide, so I can tell you a bit more about the report, the summary of the report. The report shows that innovation procurement is still underused in Europe, and other leading economies make more progress in this area. But of course, it depends a lot of dynamics and parameters. Of course, there are some aspects that some other countries are really leading with their best practices, and for the other aspects, they may fall behind. So that's why it was really a good opportunity for us to collect all this information and experience and practices in one single report. So, well, a key reason is for Europe that EU legal framework does not strongly encourage innovation procurement. Therefore, the expert group analyzed how to reduce legal barriers. So we assessed all EU member states and compared them with the 6 non-EU countries, and the report provides a comprehensive overview of barriers and insights from international practices and proposed legal solutions. So we also have recommendations to support ongoing EU initiatives, such as the Innovation Act, EU Innovation Act, and the revision of the procurement directives. We can move to the next slide. So yeah, in this section, I will be explaining the main barriers, the key findings, and the possible legal solutions that was identified in the report. And in the next slide, here you see, we put all of them. You see it's a bit dense with a lot of text, but of course it's a big study and a lot of things to share with. So, but I will brief it a bit for you. So here the experts identified several recurring legal barriers, and for instance, limited competition and transparency make it hard for innovators to find opportunities, and lack of strategic planning leads to under investment in innovation procurement. And we have the restrictive financial requirements exclude many startups and SMEs, and administrative hurdles slow down process and create unnecessary disqualification risks, especially again for SMEs and startups. And overspecified tenders reduce the space for innovative solutions. And IPR conditions often discourage suppliers by transferring too many rights to the buyer. And here we have stated contracts provide no incentives for improvement afterward. And price-only award criteria make it difficult to select innovative solutions. We have limited tools to advance EU strategic autonomy in strategic sectors. And the rules for joint cross-border procurement, they are complex and they hinder joint action between member states. So here you see, as you may recall, I have presented the findings from Draghi and Letta and ECHA reports in the previous slides. They're very similar. So that's how we verified the legal barriers that was pointed out in the previous study. So now it was.
I'm sorry, if I get thrown here too, is not only have you identified the European issues, but you actually identified the American issues as well. Exactly 2 weeks ago, Secretary Boris Hegseth gave a speech about procurement in the U.S. government. For example, he identified IPR. He actually went the opposite way. He wants the U.S. government to get more rights, but it's in terms of a list of issues. This is exactly what the Americans are dealing with as well.
Exactly. So this is also, in non-EU countries, also these are some of them identified as challenges. But also we have found, for instance, speaking of the US, we have found a lot of actually actionable steps and concrete programs for government to promote or encourage SMEs and startups to be part of innovation procurement. So that was something for us to learn. But of course, IPR challenge, it remains as it is everywhere because, it is always a hot topic. Okay, so I see something in chat, but okay, I'll check the chat later if that's okay for you. And we can move to the next slide so I can introduce you the key findings that we have identified during this study. So here, the first one is regarding national action plans and targets. So many leading countries outside Europe use national strategies or targets for innovation procurement, but most EU member states do not. Economists estimate that innovation procurement should reach 20% of total public procurement. And to achieve this, the EU needs a common definition and EU-wide targets. So member states should develop annual reforms and investment plans. And the EU should also introduce a fast-track procedure for R&D procurement to increase legal certainty and uptake. So if you move to the next slide, the second key finding was regarding innovation in all procedures. So this is a very important one. The current EU approach relies on special procedures for innovation procurement. We have special modalities like PCPs and PPIs, etc. And however, many public buyers prefer not to use them. So international experience shows that it is more effective to ensure that all procedures are implemented in an innovation-friendly way. This means integrating innovation considerations into regular procurement practice, not creating separate pathways. So this also supports more consistent uptake across the public sector. And in the next slide, here you see value for money and innovation criteria. Other leading countries require public buyers to consider innovation in all procurements, and EU rules do not provide a similar push. So as a result, buyers often lack incentives and resources to apply innovation-friendly practices, and it has been recommended making value for money criteria standard and including quality and innovation first, not only price. So it is recommended here that innovation-friendly IPR rules that allow suppliers to retain ownership while buyers obtain the rights they need. So this approach may also be benefiting both parties sharing different aspects of intellectual property assets of their innovative solution. And finally, here we highlight the importance of functional specifications and value engineering classes to allow continuous improvement. Value engineering is it's really a great concept and very interesting to talk about. So it's we have identified really good examples and practices of value engineering in the United States. And it was also detailed in the report that you can find the examples and best practices and how it was recommended as a result of this report in the detailed section. So if you move to the next slide, here the fourth finding, this is regarding facilitating access for startups. And as mentioned, current rules do not sufficiently support startup participation. Many startups face unjustified exclusion for many reasons. And key measures to improve access include more transparent and searchable publication of market consultations and innovation tenders. And another one, limiting disproportionate financial and professional requirements, because overly defined requirements and technical requirements may discourage startups and SMEs to apply go for the tender. And it's a bit scary, to put it that way. And another one, allowing startups to reach required capacity after award before contract starts. And using accelerated payments and pre-financing also can help startups to apply for innovation procurement tenders more often. And another one, reducing administrative burdens and supporting document translation, because most of the times they are lacking capacity in their organization, startups and SMEs, to interpret all of those documents and administrative burdens. And that's also one of the disadvantages for them to apply for innovation procurement tenders. And well, we also identified that these measures are widely used in other leading countries. So that is how we identified them. And in the next slide, I will be explaining the fifth key finding. This is regarding facilitating joint cross-border procurement. So here, other major economies operate under a single procurement system. In the EU, different national rules still create fragmentation. So, you know, there's, of course, EU rules, but they have to be transposed to the national applications, national laws. And this makes joint cross-border procurement difficult. This limits the ability to create sufficient demand for innovative solutions. And to address this, the report recommends creating a 28 legal regime for joint innovation procurement. And this would support scale-ups and encourage cross-border implementation of strategic projects. And in the next slide, I'm checking the time and I'll try to speed up a little bit. Sorry about that. And this is about strategic autonomy and resilience. Here you see many non-EU countries apply domestic preference measures for key sectors, and EU rules do not provide similar options. And this limits member states' ability to promote European suppliers in strategic areas. The EU could use public security and safety exemptions to strengthen autonomy where justified, but the report suggests allowing targeted measures such as strategic autonomy clauses for R&D procurement or by European preference in specific cases not covered by trade agreements, or local content options where security of supply is relevant. So these measures would support resilience in critical technologies. And in the next slide, you will see a diagram, a life cycle of innovation and gaps. Here you see it shows the life cycle of an innovation from idea all the way to large-scale deployment. And here there are several legal gaps that appears in different stages. On the left, we see the R&D phase, and there are gaps in procurement techniques and in planning and target setting. And here you see during prototype development, IPR uncertainties reduce incentives to innovate. And in the testing phase, buyers struggle to purchase first-of-a-kind solutions. And on the right side, you see the market side. Even after R&D, suppliers face gaps in procurement rules for scaling up. Without clear tools and demand signals, production remains limited in the EU. And we have some legal exemptions for R&D, like GPA, but for pre-commercial procurement. But for commercial deployment, no general GPA exemption applies. And public buyers also underuse national security or safety exemptions. So together, these gaps prevent smooth transition from idea to markets, and addressing each step is key to improving innovation uptake in public procurement. And in the next slide, you see we used also a comparison to showcase the state of play in all of the countries, and there are color codes. You can find them in this slide, and then it's also stated in the report. So the Innovation Update project compared how different regions approach innovation in public procurement. There are significant differences between EU member states and major non-EU countries. And within the EU, some governments actively promote innovative purchasing while others lag behind. And outside Europe, countries like the US, Canada, South Korea, and Japan use distinct frameworks to drive innovation. For example, the US has dedicated programs and more flexible rules for innovation procurement, whereas EU countries operate under a common directive interpreted in varying ways. And these comparisons highlight fragmentation in Europe's practices versus more unified approach abroad. And understanding these differences sets the stage for identifying legal gaps that hinder innovation uptake. And in the next slide, here you see the whole overview of the legal gaps in EU member states. So first, many countries you see lack clear strategies or mandates for innovation procurement. And even though EU laws, the directives, allow procedures like innovation partnerships or pre-commercial procurement, they are seldom used. And public buyers often stick to familiar procedures because there is no strong legal push or incentive to try a new approach. And this gap is evident when we see that some member states have no targets or action plans for buying innovative solutions. So in contrast, a few leaders have set specific goals and provide guidance, but such cases are exception. So the absence of a consistent strategy across Europe means opportunities for innovation are frequently missed. And in the next slide, you see here focusing on the non-EU countries. And you see the USA stands out. It has many mandatory rules that require tools and practices which foster innovation. And we have innovation-friendly IPR regimes here and also in South Korea or in Canada, in China, and Japan as well. And the UK, USA, Canada, and Japan provide specific guidance on key parts of the legal framework and to help to smoothen the application of those rules in the sector. And South Korea and Canada actively encourage market research and market consultations. And here you see South Korea also encourages using exemptions to buy R&D and test prototypes. And here at the bottom, you see South Korea and Japan encourage the use of value engineering in public contracts. So we can move to the next slide. These are very interesting to talk about, but yeah, I'm checking time, and let's focus on here gap analysis in standard contract conditions in EU member states. So this this shows that most EU member states do not have standard contract clauses, and some countries have optional clauses at regional level or for more like specific sectors. And in other cases, guidance exists, but it's only for certain type of clauses. And overall, there is no consistent EU-wide use of standard contract conditions. And in the next slide, here this slide is focusing on the situation for SME-friendly measures in the EU. And the table shows that most member states classify these measures as optional. And only a few countries have mandatory rules for elements such as early publication of rankings, maximum deadlines, financial compensation, or protecting subcontractors. And overall, SME supportive legislation is not widely mandatory across the EU. And in the next slide, we will see the situation in non-EU countries. So here you see US encourages advance payments and has mandatory accelerated payments, and the US and China encourage financial compensation for startups and SMEs. And the US and South Korea have rules to protect subcontractors. And also the UK, US, and Japan and China, they have measures to minimize financial requirements, and these practices show stronger SME support in several non-EU countries compared to EU countries. And the next slide. Yeah, here you see the survey results on the use of techniques. We had a survey during this study, and this slide shows that the results from so many procurement cases assessed by experts, and the 6 innovation-friendly techniques listed are used very rarely. For example, leaving IPR with contractor, you see 27%, and using functional specifications, it's 21%, and value engineering only 4%, and accepting alternative financial evidence 27%, and advance payments to SMEs, and also financial compensation to SMEs is very low, 1%. So here, this survey confirms that these techniques are underused across EU member states. And if we move to next slide, here I would like to move to the last part of my presentation about the conclusions and recommendations. You see, I will not go on detail, but just to summarize it, there are main recommendations for Innovation Act, you see here. In short, they focus on creating EU-wide targets, developing national action plans, and enabling joint procurement, improving the IPR framework, and strengthening incentives for research organizations and public buyers. And they also propose establishing basic principles for publicly funded procurement and ensuring more consistent use of R&D procurement tools across Europe. And in the last slide, we can move to the next one. This is regarding the recommendation for EU public procurement directives. So these are including introducing clear definitions of innovation procurement, because there is none, and ensuring legal provisions that support innovation in all procedures. And here we need to improve IPR rules and strengthen market analysis and transparency, and also clarifying exemptions for R&D procurement and security-related procurement. So overall, the recommendations aim to make the EU procurement framework more innovation-friendly and more consistent and easier to use across all member states. And in the next slide, okay, so these were all from me. Thank you so much. I talked a lot for listening to me.
Azra, that was wonderful. Thank you very, very much. I'm sure we'll have opportunities to follow up with you. And we're short of time, so I want to turn it over to, we're going to have Lena Racca, who has worked for many years in the Norwegian Remedies Agency, and she's going to be talking along with Hai Antran. They're going to be talking about the cultural differences. What Azra's been talking about, the contrast between the U.S. and the European Union, and Lena's, because given her vast experience as a European lawyer, she really brings a very unique perspective and understanding why there is such a interesting difference between the EU and the U.S. in approaching procurement for innovation. Lena?
Thank you so much. The reason why I wanted to compare the EU and US federal practices in multilateral negotiations is that in the United States, they make up between 40 to 60% of all federal awards. By contrast, in the European Union, procedures that allow for negotiations are only used in about 8 to 9% of above threshold procurements. And my research explores why this gap in practices exists. So if we start from the basics, we can look at the philosophical differences between the two systems. EU procurement law was designed not primarily as an efficiency tool or to achieve the best value for money, but rather as a means to create a functioning internal market and to prevent discrimination between economic operators in the member states. So therefore, EU procurement law has a strong emphasis on transparency, equal treatment between the economic operators, and also focus on objectivity, predictability, and preventing undue discretion in the hands of the contracting authorities. And these principles may be seen as expressed better procedurally through open and restricted procedures. And the logic there is that the less discretion a contracting authority has, the less there is a risk of favoritism or hidden discrimination. But if we look at the US system, the focus is that the system is built on the concept of achieving the best value or the best contracts. And that is supported up by competition and flexible engagement with industry. And I think there is a view in US federal procurement that contracting officers are able to exercise discretion responsibly, that negotiations improve quality, and that innovation often emerges from negotiations. And also that the private sector is seen as a valuable partner when the government is going to identify what their needs are. And so these differences in the fundamentals of EU procurement and US procurement explains some of the differences in uptake of the negotiated procedure. So we can move on to the next slide. So in addition to philosophy and foundational issues, there are several structural and also legal reasons why negotiations dominate in the US and not in the EU. First of all, US federal agencies are required to perform acquisition planning and market research for all significant procurements. And this means that US agencies engages early with industry, they evaluate alternative solutions early, and they can identify areas where negotiations will be beneficial to them. In contrast, in the EU, planning and market engagement is only optional. So without early market access and insights, authorities are likely to be less confident in conducting complex and negotiation-heavy procurements. Differences between the two systems I also mentioned yesterday is seen in the discretion the contracting authorities have when they evaluate the bids. Numerical ratings and also scoring systems are commonly used in bid evaluations in the EU. In the US, these are often used as evaluation tools, but they are seen as only that. This means that US agencies, after using a scoring system, they still retain discretion to document why an offer still provides better value, even though maybe they're not the best scoring offer. And I think this encourages US agencies to negotiate more because they know they can evaluate solutions more holistically and not being forced to award a contract to one economic operator based on a rigid scoring formula. Also, US federal agencies are large and specialized, whereas the average EU contracting authority is small and local. From my perspective in Norway, for instance, there are like 5.6 million people in Norway, but they are dispersed on almost 360 municipalities, which are all their own contracting agency. This means that European contracting authorities, many of them simply do not feel equipped to manage negotiations. And finally, a small but important point is that in the US system, negotiation is seen as normal. But in the EU, negotiation is culturally viewed as an exception. And we can move on to the next slide. In the 2014 directives, the negotiated procedures or the procedures allowing negotiations, the access to those procedures were expanded, but by EU's own evaluation shows that they remain underutilized. One of the things stakeholders reported was high litigation risk, lack of training, administrative burdens, and uncertainty of whether the procedures are allowed at all. So there is a movement and a growing interest in simplifying procedures, and some argue that limiting negotiation actually reduces competition because bidders value negotiations, especially in complex and innovative-driven procurements, which we see much more of in the procurement system today. And I'm wondering if Hayan would touch upon that last point about innovation.
Thanks, Lena. I want to add a few comments on the comparative size of the two US and EU system by bringing a good point that these multilateral negotiation methods could be a very good tools to facilitate public for innovations. Even though there are slightly differences between the two systems, there's they share the same purpose that can change the relationship between public buyers and the market. That in both systems, the multilateral negotiation is a powerful tool to enable innovation that contracting authorities and bidder can jointly explore alternative during the dialogue phase. This is very essential when there's no off-the-shelf product exists, and instead of forcing bidders to fit with predetermined specification, negotiations can create space for a co-design, technical explanation, and creative problem solving. For example, for an AI procurement, a government agency may not reflect the actual technology available in the market. So negotiations will allow both sides to identify the technical constraint, explore emerging solution, and conveys on an innovative option that's both achievable and future ready. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your time.
All right, thank you both very much. It was really excellent, and thank you both for yesterday's presentation today. With your joint research, you're really doing a wonderful job in pulling this together. I'm very proud to be your professor. Thank you. All right, folks, thank you for joining us for this three-session review of Procurement for Innovation. While it was nominally focused on Procurement for Innovation and European developments, as you can see, really the developments are worldwide, and it's a very rare and wonderful opportunity to share lessons learned. Would have been impossible without the support, the very cherished support of our friends at NATO Diana, and of course our colleagues here at Google. So thank you very much. The recordings from these sessions will be available shortly. They'll be available through publicprocurementinternational.com, and they'll also be available in the GW YouTube page, and they'll be available as a podcast as well. Again, thank you all very much, and take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.